Hello and welcome back to another episode of Fully Booked, the Hidden Gems author podcast, in which Craig Touch and myself, Roland, chat some of the interesting figures and leading lights of this crazy industry of writing and publishing. And today we have a very special guest who I'm kind of excited for because I just put out all my my Halloween decorations. It's Beth Castrodale, who is a writer of spooky novels. A perfect season to have you. How are you doing, Beth? We are delighted to have you join us today.
Oh, great. Thanks. I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for hosting me.
Oh, well, we are very grateful for you making the time to see us. And of course, we wouldn't be here without the man himself, Craig Touch, the owner and founder of Hidden Gems and an author himself. How are you doing today, Craig?
Doing great. Thanks, Roland, and thanks for coming on, Beth. I think that this is like one of those topics that we haven't covered at all, which is great because, we talk a lot about different aspects of writing and writing in different genres and writing this and writing that, but we haven't really talked about, scary story writing yet. And that is, I think there is a skill set there. I don't know if I would be able to write a scary story, but I don't typically watch horror movies, though. So I'm not the best person to be doing that in the first place. But with Halloween coming up, that is, I think, a great time for us to cover this topic. So why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and how you got started with all that, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, so I've loved scary stories since I was a kid. I mean, I just love, I think of the old Peter, the Peter Cushing scary scary movies, and even down to Scooby-Doo. I love the scary stories and scary books. And I started writing scary stories when I was, probably in first or second grade, and I've always been interested in it. So I think I've just been, kind of fascinated with the possibilities of them. And, I've just kept it writing for many years. I'm a late bloomer. I didn't publish my first novel till about 7 years ago, and now I'm on my fourth. I just had my fourth novel published, but it took a long time to get published, but that's a whole other story.
Yeah, I mean, it can be a challenge. Yeah, I guess you're not self-published. You're going through a traditional publisher.
Yes, yeah, an indie. Or so far it's been all indies. None of the big five or big four, or whatever they are these days. So
yeah.
Oh, which I love. I love the fact that we live in a time in which independent publishers and self-publishing is like a thing, because you can reach a whole different audience, and people who never got catered for before are getting catered for. So good for you.
Totally, I totally agree.
So what are your books typically, what kind of scariness are they? Are we thinking like Stephen King level of horror, or is it sort of more suspenseful? I don't know. What's your subgenre of this genre, I guess?
It's probably, my stuff is probably more on the literary end. Like in all truth, like my latest novel is probably my only full-on spooky, like haunted house novel. My other books are more, I would say that they're probably of a more literary bent. But speaking of, the Inhabitants, which is my novel, it actually just came out last week. It's definitely probably operating on a more psychological level. And there's definitely, I would call spirits or specters, but there's also a lot of, I'd say that people are haunted by, there's more metaphorical hauntings. People are haunted by loss or grief or that sort of thing. And that's kind of layered over these supernatural hauntings, I'd say. So.
Right. And then, so is this like I think of psychological thrillers, which sometimes could be sort of leaning towards the horror. I mean, that's the kind of stuff, if I was going to read, I think I'd want to read more of that. But is that sort of the same thing, or is that a different genre?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I guess kind of the way that I describe it a lot to people, it's not the blood and gore and the jump scares, that sort of thing. It's more of a quiet, creeping, something is going wrong and just what is it? And then that's eventually revealed. And I think it's a lot more, there's a lot more interiority to it, like what's going on with the characters and how are they haunted and, by various things in their lives, and also whatever, spectral hauntings are going on. So it definitely operates on a more in the head kind of level, but that's not to say that there's no plot. I would disagree with that. I just think it operates on a maybe a more nuanced level is what I would say.
And it's funny how the horror stories are so amazing, how they stick with you in a way that even other novels don't. It's like certain, there was a Roald Dahl story about a man who could see a monster in a mirror, and I remember reading that as like a 7-year-old, and I still remember it to this day. And it's still like, I never look at mirrors the same way. It's incredible what power it has.
I totally agree with you. I think that's exactly, and that kind of, you're getting at the kind of the point I was making, that I think with these stories, you hope that the reader is haunted, not just the character, that there's something lingering in their minds that, you know, just as you said, I could name probably countless stories where I've had that same thing, where I still, every now and then I'll stop and I'll think, oh my God, I'll never forget that scene, you know, which I love that feeling.
Yeah. I mean, when the story sticks with you after you've read it, like long after you've read it, that's when you know you've done a good job. A lot of people are scared of clowns, right? Because they've read it. And then, well, I mean, I think a lot of people are scared of clowns before it, but yeah. So what goes into building up that kind of scariness? It's a lot, I think it's a lot easier when you are watching it in a film or on TV. You know, you can create more of that atmosphere, have those jump scares that you talked about. But I think it's probably a lot more challenging when you're writing it, because you know, people are stopping and starting, and you know, you have to build it with words, and you know, a jump scare isn't necessarily gonna scare you when it's on a page, I would imagine. But it's probably more like the creepiness, or like you said, the psychological aspect of it. So how do you build all that on the page?
You know, there's a lot of different approaches. It's funny that you mentioned that, because I think for a while, even when I was a kid, I was thinking about, like, on a subconscious level, what is going on in the story and how could I scare people? But I think as I was working on the latest novel, I started trying to bring to the fore of my mind, like, what is operating in a good scary story. And there are different things that I came up with. Like, I think that one of the elements I think is really important is having the uncanny, you know, the otherworldly breaking into ordinary life, and that you have sort of a scene that everything seems to be normal, but there's just something a little bit, you know, off kilter that's going on. And there's so many horror stories that do this well. You know, it's a classic thing, you know, of, you know, you have the creepy house and someone is trying to, you know, go about their business there, and then there's something, you know, they see sort of something in the shadow of their eye, you know, that shouldn't be there. And it's just that sort of contrast between the ordinary and the uncanny that I think is really important. I think also that thinking very much about setting, like I think with my novel, The Inhabitants, the house at the center of it, it was built by an architect who thought he could influence the mind in beneficial ways, but sometimes that doesn't always work beneficially. So the setting was really important. And I think to the extent that you can create a setting that's every bit as scary as the, you know, any character in the story, that really is, you know, a very important aspect of the story. I also think that just one of the things that gets, I think maybe is one of the most important things, but it's sort of undersold with scary stories, is that having empathy for the characters, and that even the biggest villain, I think it's hard for people to care about any story if they don't have some care about the characters. And I think that I think maybe a classic example of that, I think of Stephen King's Carrie, where you have you know, that Carrie is bullied ruthlessly by her classmates and so on. You just feel a lot of empathy for her. And then when there's a climax at the school prom and she starts telepathically destroying everything, you really feel for her. You know, it's not like just, what is this horrible person doing? You really feel empathy. And I think that's just such a crucial part of probably any literature, but especially horror stories. And then just getting to the point about constructing a story. Everyone is different. Every writer is different about this, but I like to have some sort of a rough plan of where I'm going. I mean, you have this talk about plotters versus pantsers, and I'm somewhere in between. I don't like to go in totally jump into the water without having any really much of an idea, like, where am I going to? I kind of like this novel, The Inhabitants, started with the setting in the house and the architect who believed he could influence the mind, and then I wanted to put a character in there who could have a really interesting relationship with that. And I picked an artist, a portrait artist, because as an artist, she would have a very deep connection with the visual. So I started kind of just laying out some different storylines and then, you know, pursuing them and of course revising them. And I didn't plot very heavily. I just sort of left a loose structure so that I could allow myself to discover and discover new things as I wrote. So I'm sorry, I threw a lot at you there, and feel free to, you know, dig in on any of those angles that you might want to. But
I loved what you said about empathy. And I mean, that's Stephen King, especially. It's funny. I guess you can't really talk. Stephen King does so many elements in horror, right? But a character, to me, it was it. I mean, he had all these amazing characters, and you understood where their neuroses came from. And some of them came from the way their parents acted, and they still almost managed to make the parents, you could understand things that were, I don't know, empathy is like this crazy thing because it puts you in the mind of horrible people who do horrible things, and yet lets you understand why they do them. And I think to a certain extent, that's one of the most effective things about a horror, because it takes you from your safe moral center and puts you in the position of somebody who does terrible things in a way that you can actually inhabit that space. And I think that's, yeah, it's crazy how it gets under your skin.
It's true. And I think it's a lot of reason, like, you know, how there's like the, you know, like so many, I'm just pulling this out of my head, like the Mad Men series, like, you know, Don Draper's jerk in so many ways. But when you have empathy for someone like that, you actually start rooting for the bad guy in a way, because you just are, you know, you have their backstory and some of the tragedy in their life and what's going on. And I think that, you know, it's just when we kind of can even root for someone that we might find distasteful, you know, I think that is a testament to when you build empathy effectively. So.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because I feel like, and again, this comes from my lack of watching a lot of horror or reading a lot of horror. So maybe that's why I kind of feel this way. But it's like, if you give too much empathy to the villain in a horror, I feel like that might take away a bit of the horror elements of it. Like, I agree in terms of non-horror shows, you often have the empathy to the villains, like or the jerks like Draper and all that stuff, because you still want to have that connection to it. You want people to understand why they're doing those things that they're doing, but with a horror, it's more scary if to me, I don't know, maybe it just seems like it would be more scary if it's like this lunatic that is doing crazy things, murdering people and for no apparent reason, because then it's much more scary. Like if I know that, oh, he's only going after housewives, so I have nothing to worry about. but like if you understand too much of their motivations, you might start to sympathize with them and maybe not be as scared. But that's just sort of like my feeling about that as an outsider who doesn't read a lot of this. So how is it that creating the empathy really sort of adds to the horror element then?
You know, I think you raise a great point. And I think in my stories, and I think a lot of the ones that work well, it's often the protagonist that you build the most. You know, that's where you really stack up the empathy and try to have them, you know, if they're facing a really horrifying situation and you want insights into their character. I think with the kind of the villains, I mean, often I find that, you know, at least the villains and the story that I'm writing are shrouded more in mystery. So you don't really, you don't engage as deeply with them and find out what's going on. But I kind of like to have my own backstory on what's going on with them. And I'll just say in my novel, the main villain in it had like he had a horrible relationship with his father. And I don't go into that in a whole lot of depth. And it's no excuse at all for what he does. And but I think that it kind of gives you a little bit of insight into what where his mind is operating in some of this. But I totally agree with you that you have to be careful with it. I think that, I see it as more a way of laying things out and laying things out for the reader so they know this and this and that about these different characters. But it's not like playing the violins for anyone in particular. It's just kind of created a world that's rich, and you have these deeper understandings of where people are coming from, so that things fit together, and you kind of see where people are coming from, basically. So
right, yeah. So you want to give them enough backstory so you understand them, but not too much that you emphasize too much with.
Yes, precisely. Right? Exactly.
And yeah, I can see your point of why you want to do a little more plotting rather than pantsing with this sort of thing, because I think that you're when you're constructing a scary story, there's probably a lot of things you have to drop in along the way in terms of foreshadowing, or in terms of adding these creepy elements that eventually will make sense at the end, or will add to things at the end. And if you don't know what that end is, you don't know what sort of things to be dropping in along the way.
Exactly. Yeah, very well said. You really have to have kind of that understanding, and yeah, for just as you said, for foreshadowing and so forth, and to kind of crank up the spookiness so people know sort of what, if they have the background, or they're kind of cued very subtly about something, then when whatever it is hits, it's much more much stronger, I think. So definitely.
I love what you said earlier about the creepy unsettlingness. I think it's something somebody who worked in law enforcement once told me. It's like, if you're ever in a situation, something feels creepy, it's probably your gut telling you something. And I love the way a good horror story incorporates that. It's like you have what seems like a completely normal situation, but there's something just off about it, and that like triggers that primordial flight or fight instinct inside of you about that. So I think that's a really good thing to identify.
Yeah, I agree. And I think almost sometimes that stuff is scarier than somebody jumping out, the jumps. I think just sort of that anxiety, or, the mystery of what exactly is going on, can be a lot creepier than the more, blatant sort of horror moves that can be made, in my opinion, anyhow.
Yeah, for sure. So when somebody is coming to write this kind of stuff for the first time, what are some of the things that they should be thinking about in terms of how to go about it? I don't know if you need to sort of get in a mindset to write something like this, or I imagine that there's probably some things that you're doing when you're writing a story like this that you wouldn't necessarily be doing if you're writing a romance or something like that.
Yeah. I think that's true. And I think there's some, I will say that one of the things that I think is really hard, and I still struggle with, but I think it's important to get a handle on at some point, is that, and this probably applies not just to horror, but to any kind of suspense kind of work, and maybe perhaps any novel that you might read that moves forward in some way, in some interesting way, is that pacing is just so important. I think that there's a lot of opportunities for, if you drop too many of the chilling things early on, and then there's kind of like dead zones of the story, or a saggy middle, or whatever, it really, people will kind of lose patience maybe with the story. So that maybe gets back to something that I said about, for me, just doing a bit of plotting, like, how are you going to develop the characters and have quieter moments that develop things and build your understanding of the character, and when do you pace in the movement of the story and frightening elements into it. And so there has to be breathing space, I think, and it has to keep moving. And I think that it's hard, right? Because like you can't figure that all out at the outset. I think you have to write it and kind of figure it out. I mean, I feel like I went through drafts where, I did have an idea of where things were going, but I realized, like, this is kind of sagging. Maybe I need to move up this bit of the story or the plot, and like, kind of change the pacing a bit. But I think that is something that I still find really challenging as a writer. But I think that one of the things that I would, advise people who are starting out is to think about that, like to feel like, especially if you're getting, which I always recommend, I think a lot of people do, is having critique partners, whoever, people whose opinion you really trust, even to just read your drafts and say, when does the story feel like it's sagging to you? Like, are there any places where you feel like the momentum is getting lost? I think that's really, really valuable. And I think that's one thing. And just like backing up a little bit in terms of just people who are interested in horror writing, is just read a ton in your genre. I mean, I think that applies to any any genre you might write in, but I think that that probably goes without saying, and probably a lot of people who are writing horror love it already, and they are, that's maybe their have a favorite writer in mind when they're writing. And even think about in terms of pacing, think about horror movies and shows. I mean, don't limit yourself to literature. I think that you can learn a lot about how a good story is paced by viewing a lot of good well constructed television shows and movies. I think you can learn just a ton from them. So and yeah, I mean, I could go on and on about things, but that would be the main thing I would say is pacing.
I was going to say, if you find yourself writing something and you feel the pacing is lagging, how do you correct that?
Yeah, I think like it's tough. I mean, I think that sometimes I'll ask for advice from my readers. I'll think like, was there something that do you think I should have let some like twist in the plot come a little bit earlier? Or do you think maybe it's a matter of setting it up? Like I revealed the twist too soon. I should have just set it up and kind of ratcheted up the tension and then have it appear later. So it's kind of maybe trying to figure out where you should do ratcheting versus dropping in a scary element. But I think it's tough. I think like getting readers to look at it and then just kind of actually, one of my favorite things to do is to just sleep on it. I know it sounds like a cliche, but really getting away from a book. I mean, I'm amazed at how like a good night's sleep or even, out on a run in the morning and something will come to me. Sometimes I think you just need to get away from it, and things will occur to me sometimes when I'm washing the dishes or walking the dog that, sometimes you put too much pressure on yourself when you're looking at the screen, and sometimes you just need to get away from it. So that's something I do quite often.
Do you use beta readers?
I do. Yeah. I have a good, a long-standing group of people. We used to be in a writing workshop together, and we've kind of stayed in touch over the years. And we don't meet regularly like in the old days, but we just, hey, I just finished a novel. Would you mind looking at it? So I think it's crucial. I think it's definitely, for me, it's crucial to have beta readers for sure.
And they're part of they're people that specialize in your genre. Like I imagine with horror, you'd want people that really understand horror so that they can really grasp whether or not you're hitting the right beats with yours.
Yeah, it's funny that, actually this one I had like my writing in my previous books tend to be more of like literary fiction. And so the group, the writers I have, they're not really horror specialists, but more in the literary genre. But I think it's so helpful because I was hoping that this book actually is probably more like literary / horror. It's probably deeper into, the kind of the characters, it's very character driven. And so I found their comments to be very helpful. And actually they had great comments about sort of the horror aspects that maybe weren't operating as effectively as they could. But I think that it's a good idea. I mean, I think that, I think having beta readers with, that horror background could be really helpful as well. So I definitely wouldn't discourage people from doing that at all. So
you probably want to make sure your editor is familiar with the genre as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I think like, in my case, the publisher, they publish mostly literary fiction, but I think they had a good handle on the tropes, and they were, that sort of thing. So I think that definitely helped. So
do you think you'll write like another horror after this, or go back to literary?
It's funny. The one that I'm working on right now definitely has very subtly like a paranormal aspect to it. It's more literary and less paranormal than the novel that I just had published, but it has an element that creeps up as very otherworldly. I would almost say like kind of maybe magical realism would be sort of what it gets into. But it's very I think I've created a new genre. It's rural horror set on a farm, and so there's just definitely a farmer she's a 4th generation farmer, and she's the last one standing trying to hold on to her farm. And this drifter comes into town to help her, and the drifter isn't quite who she thinks they are. So that's where the creepy stuff comes in. So
Isn't Children of the Corn set on a farm?
Yeah,
imagine.
right.
Well, there's corn involved, so I didn't see it, but that would be.
Yeah, it is. It's been so long ago since I read that, but yes, I think you're right about that. Definitely.
Well, that's farms are one of those. I mean, I grew up on a farm, and yeah, there is creepy stuff that goes on all the time, and it's a wonderful setting because it's, you know, it's so out there for a lot of people. And then I love the idea of a stranger coming in.
Absolutely. Or yeah, totally. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
You're in the middle of nowhere. You know, there's not like a ton of outside lighting. Like when you're in the city, you know, there's probably strange sounds happening with the creaking of the barn as the wind goes through it, and the animals doing whatever they're doing. I can imagine a barn at night is probably one of those. You know, it's probably not as scary as a graveyard at night, but you know, I think it's getting up there.
Well, I was thinking, and we have all these the hay rides and stuff, and all these haunted attractions that open up in New Jersey here every Halloween, and most of them are farms. Most of them are like, oh, there was a weird inbred family who kept a farm here, and then I don't know, a busload of kids went missing or something, and that's how they present it. So, yeah,
no,
certain locations.
It's definitely true. You're right about that. It's like the Halloween Central, you know, for Halloween. But yeah, it's true. I mean, I remember my mom grew up on a farm that's still in our family. And I always remember like when I read In Cold Blood, and when I was, you know, the murder that took place on a farm in Kansas. And she said that she was always, when she read that book, it chilled her because the family farm is at the end of this long winding lane. And she always had this like nightmare that someone with a gun would come down the lane and like, you know, hold the family hostage or something. She said ever since she read that book, she would get spooked whenever she was on the farm. So I always kind of get a chill when I think about that. But
and I was just going to say, it's so interesting that you had the literary side of things and the horror side of things, and it's like, how did that ebb and flow in terms of your career and your path as an author?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like I thought, like for I've always wanted to write it since I've always wanted to write a scary story as an adult, and but I think I was just maybe because I was such a fan of scary stories, I was worried about not writing one that was good enough, and I kept kind of putting it off. But I think that the literary, like I love reading like literary fiction, and that's what I've tended to write. But I think that it kind of primed me to write this scary novel, because I think when you talk about a character being haunted as well as in a haunted space, I think the literary writing kind of sets you up for dealing with someone who is haunted, maybe in a very private way, but while they're, you know, experiencing these you know, whatever's going around them, which could be something horrifying. So I definitely think there's totally intermingling with that kind of the literary and the horror. I think they actually fit really well together. I don't see them as contrary at all. So in my opinion. Well,
I guess if this one just came out, you might not know, but I wonder if there's an uptick of sales for scary stories around Halloween or not.
Great question. I wish I knew. I mean, it kind of seems logical, but I wish I knew, you know. I mean, this is just anecdotal, but when people have, you know, talked to me about my novel, they said, I'm saving it to read for Halloween because I want to curl up in the house and read it when it's, so maybe that says something about it, that they want to, you know, that's kind of like the time of year when we're, you know, it's darker outside and it's maybe cold and we want to curl up with a scary book or a scary movie, that too, for that matter.
Well, I think it's something very, I mean, storytelling as an art evolved, you know, when our ancestors gathered around a campfire, and horror stories were probably one of the first forms of story to evolve. And I mean, as a kid, we used to go camping and tell each other scary stories and stuff like that. And so it's funny how it was probably one of the first forms of storytelling that ever existed. It's still a massively popular form of storytelling, and now it's evolved into horror games that my kids play, like Five Nights at Freddy's, and then horror movies like Five Nights at Freddy's that just came out. But horror movies are being made all the time, and it's such a raw, visceral human thing to find that in horror. So I was going to say, as we continue, maybe you could give us some of your tips on, if you're an author listening to this and you want to write a horror story, like what are some hot tips that you could do that really do you think would help them focus that and make what they're writing more chilling?
Yeah, so I think one of the things I touched on in terms of pacing, that might come a little later in the process. I think it's just so important, but kind of maybe come out with a sketch, or even if you're a pantser, not a plotter, you know, even just to kind of look at where the key twists or spooky things are and make sure that they're paced. However you want to do it, chart it. I've done storyboards in the past, and that's helped me personally. I think that definitely, you know, one of the things, you know, earlier in the process, if someone's just starting to write a story, I think one of the elements is like, what are the things, just make notes about what scares you the most and how to, like, I mean, just to give you an example, like maybe cemeteries really creep you out. So maybe think about, like, what does that mean? Like, can you imagine, like, for instance, a cemetery that you enter the gates and you never get out of the gates. And so what kind of alternative reality might exist behind those gates? Like, do you, are you interacting with the dead or other people who are trapped in there? Are you trying to escape? Like any kind of thing that really scares you personally, can you riff off that and just make notes and figure out any things that really horrify you that you could translate somehow to the page? And I think that really helps a lot. And I also think too, this might be, I mean, I think this is for me personally, like, I think it's like inhabit your haunted space, whatever that is. Like in my particular book, you know, it's the creepy house that the architect constructed to kind of, you know, to influence the mind. So as I was writing those scenes, I was really trying to physically be in that space so I could visualize, you know, there's, for instance, there's mantle places that are wooden mantle pillars that are carved with the faces of people that look like they might be sleeping or dead, you know, and how does that, I see that in my mind and I write about it from the character's point of view, but I try to, you know, whatever's freaking me out and chilling, you know, making me feel chilled, I try to describe it as vividly as I can. So I'm in that space, I'm seeing the creepy things and then trying to write descriptions that are as spot on as I can, and trying to make, you know, appeal to all the senses that you can, to just make it super scary. So I'm trying to think of what other things I'd recommend. Yeah, and just have fun. I think like the first thing, I mean, I think for me, the first thing I try to do is entertain myself before I entertain anyone else. And I think if you can do that, if you can even, you know, kind of, you know, I think like writing this last novel, I think there were a couple times where I actually kind of spooked myself a little bit. I'm glad I didn't write it right before bedtime. So, but you know, if you could just kind of entertain yourself, the chances are good that you're going to entertain other people as well, I believe.
I think that's a good instinct to have in most forms of writing. It's like if you're writing a romance novel and you're not getting like a little feisty about it, then you're probably not doing something right. In a horror story, it should creep you out, because in some ways you're not so much the author of it, you're almost the first reader. You're receiving it from somewhere, and then
it's true. And I think like, I mean, I think it's so true. Like, I mean, so much when you're learning, when you're kind of getting educated as a writer, you hear about always think of the reader, and in full, like, I have to be a full disclosure, I'm just thinking about the story. I'm in the story. I'm not thinking about anyone. I'm in the story. I'm in the world. I even feel myself disappearing when it's going really well, but I feel like I have to feel like at some point that it's a satisfying experience for me. And then the reader, of course, when I'm editing and revising, I think more of the reader at that stage, but I think like it has to be an experience. It has to be a personal experience first, I think, before you start thinking of the external, you know, the audience as much.
And in some ways you are writing for an audience of one. You want someone to feel like they are right in that situation.
Totally. Exactly. Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
I think, you know, when you think back to what you were saying about, you know, think about what scares you, I guess you have to also make sure that is not some, you know, random irrational fear that you have. There's certain things that I think are universally scary to or not universally, but at least they're most people or a lot of people are scared of them. I don't know why so many people are scared of clowns. Like personally, it doesn't scare me, but a lot of people seem to be scared of clowns. Spiders, and then you get movies like Arachnophobia. But if somebody's not scared of spiders, and they watch that, it's probably not as scary. I mean, obviously, things jumping out from the dark is always going to be scary, no matter what it is that's jumping out from the dark. But I guess, to my daughter, for example, who is terrified of any spider at all, that movie I would never let her watch that movie. And hopefully she never does, because just a spider in her room, she'll come screaming out. But I think if you hit the right note, you're going to be like even scarier to some people than others. But if it's well written, I think it'll probably at least be creepy to everybody at some level. But people that have more of a fear of that type of thing will be affected more by it.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it's sort of the writer's task to try to take something that's personal and make it more appealing on a broader level. I'm thinking of the clown character in it. I mean, even if you don't, even if clowns don't scare you, the way that he writes that, kind of the way that the clown exists in that novel, and some of the lines and the way that he appears, I mean, it's so deeply creepy and well done. I think like it's sort of that the writer has to be they really have to make their own personal fear translate and whatever, however they can do it. And but you're right. I think that's something you have to be mindful of, is this: if it's something that scares me, I need to do everything I can to make sure it would scare the pants off of someone else, even if they don't have that scare themselves.
That's
it all goes to the atmosphere that you create, right?
Yeah.
Stephen King has just the way he manages to do exactly what you described earlier, and of like making everything just seem a little off kilter is so great. I love his Dark Tower books, and he writes about these people who come from this other world, and they just don't look quite right. They have like almost as if their faces are attached, and then you see their cars, and they've got like 4 vents on one side and 3 vents on the other. And in real life, sometimes you notice things like that, and you're like, it's almost, is he writing about something? Did he invent something, or did he channel something? And I think sometimes with really good horror stories, it feels like the author isn't inventing something to scare you. They are just channeling something to scare you, and that's why it's so visceral and like instinctual, is because it's like the author has recognized the same creepy thing that you encounter.
Yeah, he's great at that. It's almost like, you almost feel like sometimes with his writing and other great writers of horror, that something that they really just hit it, whatever thing that they scared the heck out of them, they're just able to just perfectly channel that. And often it is, and really off kilter, that something is just something is off, and in a way that is it makes it even more creepy. That I just think that's so well done with his writing and other great writers of horror, for sure.
So I was going to ask you, what's the creepiest thing that has ever happened to you? Because surely you don't get into writing horror unless you've got some experience of creepy things. So is there anything creepy or inexplicable that happened to you?
Yeah. So this was years ago. I used to live I worked on Cape Cod, and I had the great fortune of living at a place that was probably like a football field away from the ocean. So like you could hear the ocean at night, and it was this cute little attached cottage to a house. It was really, it's shingled place. It was just gorgeous. And I loved that place, and I still love my memories of it. But I would go off to work, and it was probably in May. It was a warm weather month, and I got home, and the thermostat was turned all the way up, and then the upstairs casement windows, which were locked solid during the day, were wide open. And I thought, my landlord would always let me, like, I was the only one other than the landlord who had the key, and the landlord would always tell me if anyone was going to come in, and that didn't happen. And actually that day, my landlord said, do you mind keeping the windows closed? Because the rain can get in. And I didn't have I was too like bashful to say, like, I didn't open them. But then, I thought, well, that's weird, but I'll just let that one ride. And then a couple of weeks later, the exact same thing happened again. And at that point, I mean, I wasn't really sure what was going on. Like I was starting to speculate, like my landlord had a daughter who lived in that place where I was, and she died. I don't know if she died on the premises, but she died very young. And I was like, something weird going on with her. I mean, who knows? I didn't know. And at work, I remember one of my coworkers, I didn't tell many people about it because I thought, like, this is just really weird. But one of my coworkers, I told about it. She goes, "Oh, I can burn sage or something." And I think I was a little skeptical. I'm like, I don't think I need that, now. But anyhow, that was the last of it, and it didn't happen again. And it was creepy, but it almost felt like I got pranked in a way. Like it wasn't. I didn't feel like some ghost was, like there was some spirit that was trying to interact with me. It was almost maybe poltergeisty in a way, would be how I describe it. But it was definitely creepy, and I cannot explain how. So, but I love hearing ghosts. I love hearing whenever I get together with people and the topic runs. I definitely love it when someone has a good story like that. I always love to hear them. But
no, I like that because I think. Oh, go ahead, Craig.
I was just gonna say, I think it depends on how your mind works. To me, I'd be like thinking, for sure, I would be thinking somebody's pranking me. I would never go to, in my head, I would never go to, oh, there's a ghost or a poltergeist, because I'm just not, that's just not the way my logical brain works. Mm-hmm. I would absolutely be thinking, oh, the landlord is pranking me, or, or I'd be worried somebody broke in and opened all the windows. That's
right.
Definitely where my mind would go. Yeah.
Sure. No, I understand that. I'm borderline. I mean, I'm open. I want to be open. Like, I feel like there's so many people who report these things that I try to be open about it. But I also share your thought about, like, try to eliminate, first try to eliminate anything that it could possibly explain it. I think that makes a lot of sense.
I think that's the whole thing, isn't it? The brain invents explanations for things when no explanations are actually present there.
Yeah. Definitely. It's
I think if you are the type of person that believes all that stuff, then I think you're probably more likely to want to read about, like horror. To me, it's like, reading horror is kind of like reading fantasy to me, and which I love. I love fantasy, science fiction, all that stuff. But horror is kind of like, I don't know. It's just because it's set in the real world, and I'm supposed to believe that this stuff happens, and I'm such a skeptic that I'm always I'm not that I wouldn't be scared by it, but I'd always be questioning everything, right? So,
mm-hmm. Sure.
My sad little brain works.
Oh no, well, I understand that.
I was going to say there's almost an intrinsic scene in every good horror story, and especially every good horror film, is when you think there's a rational explanation for whatever's happening, and then you kind of like test that assumption, and suddenly it's like, oh wait, no, this isn't normal. Like, I don't know, the TV keeps switching on, and then you go and unplug it and you walk away and the TV switches on, and that's the moment in the story where it's like stuff gets real, because it's like, whoa, right, this doesn't have an explanation behind it. And I think that happens in every story, really, and every good horror story.
Exactly. A lot of times the characters are sort of, I think it's human nature to feel like there has to be some rational explanation for this, and if not, I mean, the story I'm writing now, something weird happens, and two characters are discussing it in a bar afterwards, and the one character says, there's all these drugs that are, fentanyl, there's trank, and maybe there's some drug that they're putting in our, somebody slipped you a Mickey or some drug that is making you hallucinate, because I can't believe what you just described. Like there's always got to be an explanation for what's happening. So yeah, I definitely think that's the drive. And then I think a good story kind of opens up the mystery around that and makes you think maybe not,
Because I mean, I'm like you guys. I'm quite a skeptical person, and then a movie like The Exorcist gets me, even though I'm completely non-religious. I don't believe in any of that stuff. And then it's like, imagine if you were in a situation where something like that happened in front of you. You'd be like, well, maybe I can't understand this. And as soon as you can't understand something, then you have the power taken away from you. Because if you can understand something, you can fix it. If you can't understand it, you can't fix it. And that's where that feeling of helplessness in horror comes from.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, helplessness is a good word, good description of it, for sure.
Yeah, that's the one thing that always sort of gets me in a lot of these movies, whether they're horror or you know, some kind of fantastical thing. It doesn't have to be horror, but, you know, sort of like those urban fantasies where magic is sort of all of a sudden happening in the world where there never was anything like that before. People, in my opinion, people in those shows, normal people in those shows, tend to accept them far more readily than I ever would. Like, I'd be freaking out the entire, like, everyone's just like, wow, that's crazy. Wow, so what can we do with that? No, my brain would be like, no, none of this makes sense. And it would take me a long, long time to try to reconcile that. Like,
I think it's a good idea, though, to have a devil's advocate character, too. I mean, I think that can make it really, like, have someone stand in for readers who are more skeptical, because, you know, I sometimes I get impatient with that with movies or film. I'm like, come on, you guys, like, you know, this can't, like, what, you know, I don't know. You just kind of want people to kind of be being more critical, have more critical thinking around it. And I think it's stronger when you do have someone who's doing that, and maybe they never are convinced, and that, you know, that can be a strong element too, that kind of, you know, pokes at the story a little bit. And, you know, you have, I just think that there's something to be said for having that kind of tension in the story. And it also, I think it gives people respect to the readers who might be more skeptical as well. So something to think about when you're writing.
Aren't those characters usually the first ones to die? It's like, yeah, none of this is true. I don't think there's a murder on the loose. And then like, ding, 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 you know.
You're right. That's so true. That's a really good point. But yeah, let them live longer so they can continue to be like a, you know, advocate for the skeptics. But that's a really good point. Excellent point.
Actually, you know what? Thinking about that, that's often where, maybe not so much in films, but in horror stories, one of the things that's really cool is when you have certain expectations about what's going to happen, and then they subvert those expectations, because once again, it makes you feel like you lose control of the situation because things aren't predictable.
Absolutely. I think that's an excellent point, that I think, like, you know, that's something else for story construction to think about, you know, maybe asking your beta readers, did you see this coming? And sometimes you see something coming and it's fine, you know, does it need more of a twist, or, you know, whatever. I think that's a really, really good point to bear in mind. And sometimes the unexpected, you know, I'm just thinking of some movies and books that sometimes the unexpected is just so strange, it blows your mind. Like, I love that, you know, but you did not see it coming at all. I think that's the best, for sure.
Now, unfortunately, we are approaching the top of the hour, but before we start asking you, Beth, where everyone can find out everything about you, how about, okay, if you're going to settle down to watch one horror film this spooky season, which horror film do you recommend?
Oh man, there's so many of them. It's so hard for me to pick. I mean, one that I keep thinking about is Heredity.
Oh, I've heard. I haven't.
Yeah.
I get very skeeved out by horror films, so I've seen that and it looks too creepy for me to even attempt to watch it.
Yeah, it's scary. I mean, it really operates on a psychological level. I mean, it scared me. It's one of those movies that scared me so much I don't think I could never watch it again. But if you really want to get freaked out, scared, that one did it for me. There was one that I thought was so great. Who is the? I wish I had thought of this before the question came up. But the Ruth Wilson, I think, is in it, and she's a nurse that she takes care of this person who's ill, and it's so creepy. It's very quiet. And I bet you if you Googled Ruth Wilson nurse scary house, and it just it might be The Pretty Things That Live in the House. That might be the name of it. That was a really, I thought, very quietly, psychologically effective horror movie that I really liked. I think it was The Pretty Things That Live in the House, something like that. I really liked that one as well.
That's a good title. That's a creepy title. Just
yes, yeah, exactly. And maybe one more I would mention is the other with, it had Nicole Kidman. I don't know if you.
I've heard of. Yeah, I haven't actually watched that one, but I've heard of it.
Oh, that's a good one. If you like something that's scary but not too over the top, like I can't go to sleep after it, that's a good one to see, I think. But
well, so this has been a wonderful conversation, Craig. Before we ask Beth to tell us everywhere where people can find us, do you have any final questions?
No, I just you know, I I really appreciate you coming on, taking the time, because this, like I said, this is something that we haven't really talked about, and I think it's really fascinating to talk about other genres and the things that go into them that, you know, authors need to think about when they are going to write something like that, because not all writing is the same. Not all, you know, like the act of writing obviously is the same, but, you know, this sort of the thoughts that go into the process that you have to do, you know, the planning, and those all can differ from genre to genre. So I appreciate you coming in and walking us through, you know, the art of scary story writing.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. I really appreciate you guys hosting me. It's been a lot of fun.
So Beth, where can people find out more about your writing, more about your work?
So probably the best thing to do would be to go to bethcastrodale.com. And that's where you can find all my books. And if you know, I have a blog there and so on and so forth. And yeah, so that's probably the best place for them to go. And I have kind of front and center there is my novel, The Inhabitants, the spooky novel, which it just came out last week. So if people are interested in that, they can learn more about that there. So,
well, that is wonderful. We will pop a link down below in the description of this video. So whether you're listening or as a podcast or whether you're watching on YouTube, why don't you take a moment and scroll right down there, click on that link and find out all about The Inhabitants. But as you do so, you'll pass this big blank space where you can actually leave a comment. So why don't you leave Beth a comment and let her know how much you've appreciated all the wisdom she has shared with us today. There's also a like button. There's the subscribe button. There's even a little bell icon, which if you click on that, you will get notified every time there is a new episode of Fully Booked, and there will be a brand new episode next week. So until then, thank you very much, Beth, and thank you everyone for joining us.